Welcome back to another episode of On the Subject. I'm your host, Michael Vilardo. We are so excited today. We have an incredible guest. We have an actual live student. This is an incredible leader, activist, government associate. She's done it all, and she's so incredibly driven that I'm so inspired to sit here next to her. It's Sophie Szew. She is a student at Stanford University, one of, if not the best university in the entire world. And she decided to spend an afternoon with us today. And we can't wait to learn more about her and why education has played such a big part in her journey so far. Thank you for joining the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here. There's no other way I'd want to be spending my Friday afternoon. And yeah, super excited to dive in and talk a little bit about education and a whole bunch of other stuff. And yeah, super excited to be here. Thank you for the very kind introduction.
Absolutely. We're so excited to chat more. And so I love to start with what education has meant to you. You know, you grew up in Los Angeles area, you went to public school, which sometimes can be rare in LA. How was that going to public school? What made your family want to go after the public school situation? Because a lot of folks out for private school in LA. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, actually, I started off going to private Jewish school from preschool until around the time I was in the 10th grade. So I was someone that grew up kind of with the same class of like 30 kids, and we kind of like all stuck in a bubble throughout that entire time. And the environment that created for me was it felt very insular and claustrophobic. And obviously, can be very beautiful things about existing in community with people for that long, but it could also be very limiting. So one of the benefits that like I definitely think are out there with public school is kind of the ability to see that community grow and change as you have more variety, as more kids come and go, and it's kind of more free flowing in that sense. So I didn't really begin to interact with the public school system until around 10th or 11th grade. And like, there definitely was that difference there. It was definitely a bit of like a culture shock for me, growing up, having half of my day spent learning Jewish studies and half of it being, regular school. But it being the exact same classroom and like, exactly who your teacher's going to be the next year. Like, it's a very small universe compared to public school where you're kind of exposed to a lot of different things. So I guess that's the biggest difference that I've seen.
Who made the decision to make the school change? Was it your parents? Was it you? How did that discussion go out?
Yeah, well, that was actually a lot. There was a lot more that went into that decision than just simply let's change schools. I had to completely drop out of school in the 10th grade because I ended up in the hospital with an eating disorder, which is something I publicly talk about a lot. And I talk about what it's like to be institutionalized for mental health conditions. I do a lot of advocacy around just general institutionalization for disabled folks and how that interacts with general institutionalization and carceral systems in the country. And that's something that I'm very passionate about, having that lens of lived experience with what I went through. But kind of during that time, basically the private school that I went to couldn't really accommodate for my needs. And it's really an interesting thing to think about how a public school is better suited to do so, because that can seem very counterintuitive. But what I think about public school is like, a lot of times the way that it's structured is it's like kids have to be in school. They have to learn how to accommodate for something like that because you need to be in school. So I think it was just kind of at the time my parents and I were trying to figure out how to go about re-entering the school system. And my public school, which was Beverly Hills High School, they had a program which is, pretty rare, where it's kind of more individualized, independent learning. And this was right before COVID when I re-entered high school. It was like October of 2019. And there's a program called the Independent Learning Center through BHHS, and basically you teach yourself the rest of high school. And it's designed specifically for kids that kind of have careers. So a lot of them are actors and models, which makes sense given the area. Some of them are athletes, but some of them were just not able to stay in a more institutionalized, classroom-based academic setting for whatever reason. And you're set up with one teacher, and that's the one person that kind of guides you through every subject. You kind of just teach it to yourself using an online platform. And because, I was still kind of trying to figure out my way back into the social world after having been completely isolated from it for 2 years, going back and being thrown back into a social setting just did not seem feasible to accommodate for my needs. So that just kind of made the most sense.
Well, thank you so much for your courage. Love how passionate you are about helping people. And you sharing your story, it inspires so many other young and old people to be able to be themselves and get the help needed. And I love that you're so passionate about it. And thank you for being so vulnerable on the pod. Let's talk about what the online platform was, because you have such a unique experience in high school. You went into multiple different modalities and you lived through a pandemic.
Mm.
And so what was that like? What was it like being a high schooler during that time? And how did the school support you from a digital curriculum standpoint?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I like to call myself ground zero, patient zero for Zoom, because I was actually using Zoom before the pandemic, while I was in the hospital, actually, and trying to figure out, how to meet the legal requirements for school. I used Zoom for some time, kind of, to be able to interact with teachers outside the hospital because I was, there for so long. And then, yeah, coming back into the real world, coming back, so to speak, and coming back into school. The online platform that I used at first was not kind of video call based. It was just kind of pretty much an online textbook that you flip through, and like it has some like quizzes built in, and like you finish the chapters, and then you finish, each course class has like 9 chapters, and you just kind of go through them. The cool thing about it is that it allowed me to take AP classes and kind of self-teach. But I'm not gonna lie, it was very difficult not having an expert in that subject matter kind of guiding me through it, because the one teacher that I did have, who was an incredible kind of like mentor and supporting figure for me, was not specialized in those subjects. Before, taking up the position she did, I believe she might have taught, I think it was middle school English, something like that. So I was kind of sitting there trying to figure out AP stats by myself.
Wow.
And a lot of what that did was kind of teach me that independence. And I think it did prepare me pretty well for college and for my gap year and just for the professional world, where you don't necessarily always have a subject matter expert to turn to and ask all the questions and kind of handhold you through everything. But it is definitely a learning curve, and I do not think it's a perfectly set up system by any means. And yeah, it was definitely a bit of a struggle sometimes, just like having to do that research. And um,
What was the product?
the product was called Apex
Apex.
Learning.
And so while it may not be the best situation for you, and there's definitely ways to improve the product, you talked about the independence and the self-discipline it taught you and some of the intangible skill sets that it had you focus more on. Do you think there's value in challenging young people into taking more ownership and agency over their education like you had to do?
Oh, absolutely. I definitely think that there's a lot of value in that. That way, students can kind of gravitate towards what they're interested in and where their passions lie. And it kind of levels the playing field in equally valuing different kinds of knowledge that are not traditionally valued when you're looking at a classroom setting. And I guess what I mean by that is like, if you are someone, that is presented with this platform and you got to like figure out what subjects you're going to learn, like you can kind of order that and time manage yourself. Whereas a lot of times, like in a high school curriculum, the time management is like built in. It's like,
Yep.
this is due X day, being able to figure that out and prioritize it in a way that works with your way that you function, with your brain chemistry, with your interests, is a really great way to kind of build that confidence and that value in the way that your mind works and really come to appreciate it and work with it and nurture it, which is something that is I don't see being done a lot of times in traditional school settings, where it's just like you need to learn in this way, and if you don't stick to it, you're not going to be successful.
And what would you like to see more out of Apex? What could have made it for you?
Yeah, I think just the platform itself was very outdated. I always tell the story about how I was trying to go through the AP government curriculum, and they said when Bill Clinton gets inaugurated into office.
That was a long time ago. That was before your
So,
time.
and I mean, some of the questions on the AP exam were dealing with, post-Trump,
Yeah,
which
well
is
said.
also very funny to think about saying the word post now
Yeah.
sitting here where I am today. Um,
What a day in American history.
Very much so. I'm an American studies major, so I can go on about this for a bit. But yeah, I definitely think like actually updating the platform itself would have been very helpful for me. And then there wasn't a lot of video content or kind of like teacher simulation esque um type of content like we do see in products like Subject, where it does feel like at least you get to form some sort of personal connection. And there was very little community building on the platform as well, because I think that is a skill that is very important. I think I've kind of gotten both ends of the spectrum, where I was kind of like very much ingrained into a community that I guess at some point became more insular and could feel a little bit suffocating at times. But then I was completely alone. Like, we didn't really have those like discussion settings where you
Yep.
could see how other students like minds were working through this. We didn't have those opportunities to collaborate with our peers. There really was no concept of peer built into the platform, and I think that made it feel a little bit isolating at times.
No, I love your perspective and how articulate you are about not only the intangibles and intellectual stimulation, but also the emotional stimulation, which is so important for a young person. And so when you look at going to such an incredible school like Stanford, the heart of Silicon Valley, so many great entrepreneurs, government leaders, it's just such a special place. You have students who have come from public school, private school, elite prep schools, homeschool, international schools. How do you see the backgrounds of you and your classmates varying levels of ability to handle the rigor? It's a rigorous education. Have you noticed a difference across your classmates depending on what type of school they went to, how they're performing on campus?
Hmm. That's definitely an interesting question. Um, I think that kind of everyone just kind of gets thrown into that world and has some sort of adaptation to do. What that adaptation is looks different. And I think what we say about, being at Stanford is like you are everyone kind of like has something that they are like really, really deeply, I'd say even use the word obsessed with.
I love that. No,
Yeah.
we're all about obsession here. Obsession is passion.
Yeah,
It's really
absolutely.
important.
And like, talking about the world of like creative writing, we literally embrace
Yes.
that term so much, so often.
Well, I love that. I'm going to take that from you guys.
Yeah, it's great. And it's just like, kind of why would we have words like that have a negative connotation? What does that say about us? But
I completely agree.
exactly.
Let's go.
But yeah, everyone is coming like, with their own backgrounds, with their own passions, whether that was, something that they took up because they had to or because they chose to. And I think kind of the students that are able to lean into that root of like why they love to learn are the ones that end up feeling the most at home in that space, or creating their own sense of home, because it can feel very hostile and unwelcoming at times. For a lot of students, just because the way that it's built, it is all very, institutional. You're at the heart of Silicon
Yep.
Valley. There's all this pressure in the world. Like, what, 50% of students go into computer science? That's like the
Wow.
furthest thing from what I'm doing, If that's no hate at all, like no,
Oh,
like
no, no, no.
but
That does a shocking. Well, so
yeah,
like, how'd you get into Stanford? Tell us that story
that's a
because that is
wonderful question.
yeah.
I read my application file and I still do not know the answer to that question. But I can talk a little bit about kind of my college application journey, like gladly. But in terms of just like why Stanford, I had a couple of options kind of post gap year. So the year that I got accepted, I started in 2022. And I just felt like it made sense for me to stay in the US, because some of my options were abroad.
Where were you thinking about going abroad?
Oxford. That
Wow, that's
was
a
like
great
my big
school.
debate was Stanford versus Oxford. And I toured Oxford, and the specific college that I got into felt a little bit like it could have replicated my middle school experience, where they are divided into 30 colleges, and I'd be with the same cohort of around 17 kids for all 4
Oh, wow,
years,
yeah, it's very small.
which would have, I would have gotten to know them very well, but I felt like I kind of needed that opportunity to meet people, and to have community, but what I would call a more flexible, fluid community.
Yep.
So I think like ultimately I saw that being a possibility for me at Stanford. And I do appreciate that it is a research-based institution, and I do appreciate how much emphasis they put on interdisciplinarity. Like I am a double major in American Studies and Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, and a double minor in Creative Writing and Human Rights.
Wow.
That's like a lot, but when I take a class, I know for a fact it'll count towards
Yeah.
requirements of one of those four, because I take a class that I love and it'll work. It'll work. It's not like that with every major. I got very lucky with that, but just kind of like the ability to like take a class at the med school, about like literacy in
Yeah.
medicine, and have it, be able to research that from a comparative race studies angle. and have that count towards my major, and then like work with my advisor to develop that into like a project. Like that's really cool that they have all those resources, and like I wanted to be able to, I guess, take advantage of that.
So what's it like being in the comparative race studies? That sounds so fascinating. Could you indulge our listeners in some of the
Oh,
things that you've learned?
yes. So I can go into the history of that at Stanford a little bit. It's actually a major that, like, I think in a lot of college campuses, just ethnic studies in general, were started after student
Yep.
protests in the wake of apartheid in South Africa and the war in Vietnam. And I think it's just very powerful, kind of knowing that I exist in this institutional space because of the work of people that fought for it. And also knowing that, it is can be manipulated as like a band-aid to a very big deep solution, because what they were protesting was much deeper than simply changing what departments existed. But the fact that this was a tangible victory and the tangible work of student activists feels very, very powerful. And that's like an energy that I feel literally courses through all the students that are in that major with me. There's I can This is getting very comparative studies in race and
No,
ethnicity
I just love I love
territory.
your passion,
Um,
and you have so much agency over your own education. Like how did you were you always this way? Have you always been so driven? Like what experience was it your parents, what made you so intentional about your life? I
oh,
think it's
that's a
really
good
great because 'cause you're
question.
super passionate.
I appreciate it. I think part of that intentionality did come from having the opportunity and I guess the necessity to do it by myself. Because when I did have to leave the normative high school setting for, my own reasons and my own challenges, I was kind of, obviously still in a very privileged space, but I was, kind of just there needing to lean into creating a new identity for myself because I literally had to wipe the slate clean and start over. So the way that I like explain it is like I spent 2 years like staring at like whitewashed hospital walls, and like I got the privilege to decide what it was going to be colored with, what my world was going to be colored with once I broke those down. And I, really try to be very intentional about making sure that I keep as much of that agency as I can. And also recognizing that that's a huge, immense privilege that I have, and that comes with access. That's something that I can access because I, go somewhere like Stanford, where I'm allowed to explore these things and think about them and put language to them and kind of put them in conversation and have them be taken seriously. But I do know that there are people kind of thinking through a lot of the concepts that I'm thinking through that are not getting that recognition, that are simply thinking through them for survival, that are simply thinking through them because that's what they're doing, but it's not being kind of like, recognized because they don't necessarily have the academic language to put to it, if that makes sense. So I think it's almost like everyone does create their own path in one way or another eventually. It's just a matter of who really gets celebrated for it and for what reason.
But I like the thread you've been able to, portray here about, empowering the opportunities to be anonymous, to be able to create new
Yeah.
identities and, love yourself. Self-love is so important and always
Mhm.
understanding that you don't have to be the same person you were 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. And I think that was something that you really were able to embody how you switched schools and, now you're at Stanford. You're meeting new people all the time. You're able to meet more people that you want to be around. You get to ascribe your own environment. And that's one of the beautiful parts about education
Mhm.
is if you take agency over it and you really are intentional about where you want to go to school, what you want to study, you can find people that bring the best out of you and be a happier, more fulfilled person. Would you say that, the last year or two has been one of the most exciting chapters of your life? And how do you look at the next couple of years? You have so many internships you could do, you have the whole world at your fingertips. How has the last couple of years been different for you than, high school?
Yeah, it's funny, because I like to say this year I almost, like, slowed down because I stayed on campus almost for the whole year, which was very different than how it's been because, I spent my gap year alone in DC interning, and that felt very even more kind of, like, freeing than being somewhere like Stanford, which we call the Stanford bubble.
Yeah.
Um, and I think like, yeah, these past 2, 3 years, like, have definitely been a time of self-discovery, but the way that I describe it above all is have been a time of building my own sense of home within myself, within the people that I exist around, within the different places that I live, an academic home, but most of all, feeling at home in my body, in my mind, just like kind of making sure that like I am doing what I need to do to feel like I am contributing what I aspire to the world and, to help, I guess, people figure out how to build that identity for themselves as well as like my big goal overall is just to make sure that people can kind of like access that confidence that like yeah, it's worth it to kind of like explore the things that you hope to explore or kind of like dive into the things that you obsess over. Like, just
Yes,
embrace them.
obsessed. Passion is
Exactly.
obsession. You talk about this gap year. What made you decide to do a gap year, and how do you think that helped you going to Stanford or any university, but in your case, Stanford, as a more mature person?
Yeah, I'm definitely big proponent of gap years. Like anytime anybody asks me about it and they're like high school age, I'm like,
Yeah.
take one.
Yeah.
Obviously different circumstances for different people, but one of the best decisions I've ever made. And it was something I decided before even applying to college. I kind of knew I'd graduate to a gap year and then apply during my gap year. I think functionally that made a lot of sense for me because in the academic setting I was in, I really wasn't getting a lot of support on my college applications anyways because it was the independent learning center. It's not really set up for students to matriculate to college necessarily. And it's like we have access to like the general public school counselor, but like that's kind of it. Like there's not
Mhm.
really much guidance through the application process. And I kind of also knew that like the place that I was at, did not feel like home for me,
Yeah.
and I had a lot more home building to do before I went to college, and that had to happen for me outside of my pretty small Jewish community in LA. And I moved to DC, as I said, and, having that opportunity to kind of, like, live by myself and, like, it's an internship, it's not, like, necessarily the same as a full-time job, but kind of, like, live in the world functionally as an adult gave me a lot of that kind of independence and confidence in my skills to kind of meet my needs that definitely transferred over into college. And because I was no longer in high school, I had so much time to pursue those interests and really, really dive into them and kind of like turn them from, just like more academic projects I'm writing essays about to like actual actionable projects that happen like in a institutional setting or like more professional based setting. So it's like when I would be, you know maybe in high school like writing a paper, not even, that's like more of a college thing to do. I don't know,
Mm.
reading about like mental health policy, like actually working in the space of mental health policy is a very different thing to do.
I completely agree. And, for myself, I spent a year at multiple community colleges before I
Mhm.
went to Penn,
Yeah.
and I felt so much better prepared to handle my transition to Penn from an emotional and, intellectual standpoint than I would have right out of high school. And so I think, gap years, community college, there's a lot of opportunities to be able to go slow to go fast.
Yeah.
Everyone's in a rush these days, but there's no race here. The goal is to have the most fulfilling, impactful life possible, and whatever fulfillment and fun and happiness looks to you, it may be different than someone else, but finding that fulfillment at 30, 35, 40 is not requirement of you being at X or Y step at 20, 21, 22. It's about getting into the best situation possible. And, one thing I always recognize, so I played hockey and baseball growing up. Some of my hockey teammates who did a gap year and then do a gap year and they, get to go play hockey at Harvard or one of these incredible schools. Far better opportunity than someone rushing out of high school to go to somewhere that may not be Harvard. And of course, there's a million great schools out there. You don't have to go to Harvard or Stanford to be successful, but your opportunities are much greater depending on what school you go to. And that's just a fact of being. And so I'm, so inspired for your journey and love that you were able to learn so much in your gap year and then have such a great experience at Stanford so far. And so what are you doing this summer? Tell us about that. You're going to New York. You're going to be helping so many people. Like, how did you land this internship? And, what do you advise young people? Some of our listeners that are in high school or college. Like, how young should you start beginning internships? You started pretty young.
I did start pretty young, and obviously this is a matter of access and, I am very lucky that I did have the opportunity to start that internship process young, and product of that was like taking a gap year and like
Yep.
taking the time to do so. Like it is very hard to balance any kind of work while you're still in school, and like I really do applaud my peers that do it. And I also had like a part-time teaching job during some of high school. And even
Where'd you
that was a
teach?
lot. Actually, at my elementary school has like a religious school attached. Like the temple has like a bar mitzvah prep program kind of.
Nice.
And it starts in like first grade, with kids just kind of like learning the basic letters and concepts. And I was a teacher's aide,
That's
doing some of
awesome.
that
That's
work
great
during high school.
experience.
My sister did it too. It's kind of like a family, tradition, I guess. It's a fun way to kind of dip our toes into the education scene from the non-student side. But yeah, I think like for young people that are seeking to kind of start looking at these more professional opportunities, I definitely think like it does not hurt to reach out to people. And what I found is like people are very excited to talk about what they do to young people. Like if you just reach out to your teacher, someone in your community that inspires you, that maybe holds a job that you're interested in, that does something that, you're curious about, simply like asking and saying like, hey, tell me more about, you know, why you got into teaching, or, why you got into whatever it is they did, or like what was your time like in law school, or when did you first learn how to fix cars? Like people are really excited about that. They want to talk about their obsessions.
Yeah.
That's, I
People
think,
love being able to tell stories about themselves. It's
yeah,
fun.
they do. People love talking about themselves. I mean, I'm doing it right now. So I think like, kind of coming at it from a place of like, just holding that confidence that if anything, you're going to learn. Like, that's just like the worst case. That's not
You
necessarily the
win or
worst
you
case scenario,
learn.
but yeah,
You
you win or
win
you
or you
learn.
learn. You never
Exactly.
lose. You never
Yeah.
lose. So the biggest thing I'd love to be able to give our listeners to be able to, summate all your incredible experiences is like if you could speak back to your 14, 15-year-old self and be like, hey, you're gonna go through some challenges here and there's gonna be some hard times, but like look at the life that's gonna come of this and you're gonna be able to come out of this stronger than ever. How would you advise a young person to be able to navigate the challenges of teenage years these days?
Yeah. I think, being a young person this like in this day and
It's
age
really hard.
is very challenging, and like we are shouldering the burdens of the world, and it's a lot, and it can feel very lonely and isolating. The biggest piece of advice that I'd give to my younger self and give to younger people is that you're going to hear so often that there are things that you can do to change it. Just go get more sleep, take some deep breaths, get outside more. Like, those are things that you're hearing all the time, and it's like, yes, they can fix things in the immediate, but there are so many issues out there that are systemic, and by simply focusing on getting more sleep, we aren't fixing it. We have to be able to conceptualize bigger picture why we are taking those actions. What is like the bigger overarching why? Because if you tell a young person to get off their screen, but don't give them a reason to, they're not going to do it. So it's just a matter of like, for me, it became like, okay, telling me to get more sleep is not going to fix the mental health crisis, but explaining that I need to take care of my body and my mind to the best of my abilities in order to be able to, contribute to the collective, to contribute to communities, to contribute to getting at the root cause of the very thing causing the crisis, which is so much instability and inequity in the world and so many different things. If you tell me that me doing that will contribute to the actual root cause, that makes a lot more sense for me. So I guess that's what I'd tell my younger self, is to not lose sight of that. To not lose sight of the fact that like that narrative is constantly being pushed. People are constantly trying to put individualized band-aids on communal, intergenerational, systemic bullet holes. And like the greatest power that you can have as a young person is remembering that that is what's happening, and remembering your place. And it's a lot of pressure. It really is. But I think like it can feel like that pressure is going towards something good, and towards something fulfilling and towards something sustainable, um, when you don't lose sight of kind of like that systemic underpinning.
That was really, really well said. I
Thank you.
cannot even be able to come close to being as articulate as you, but I'm so impressed. And, I really appreciate how much you care about helping the world. It's just so infectious. You truly care about society and communities. I heard you say that multiple times. And, we here at Subject just believe education is the greatest equalizer. There's obviously not perfect. There's a long way to go, but if we can help more students have a chance of finding their best version of themselves, we'll have a much better world and much better society. And thank you for contributing to it. And thank you, Sophie, to joining me on the subject. We'll be back with another episode shortly, but really appreciate taking the time and good luck this summer in New York. You're going to take care of the Big Apple.
Thank you.